So I'll confess that looking back, I do not envy some of the teachers who had me as a student back in middle school and high school, namely the English teachers or language arts or whatever your preferred terminology. You see, I was quite frankly quite a pain to have in English class. I was quite a pain because I absolutely hated doing some of the types of things that we were regularly asked to do in those classes. Irony of ironies, of course, that I would now, these many years later, find myself in this vocation where reading and especially writing occupy so much of my attention. One of the things that we had to do quite regularly in our English classes were known as reading logs. That's a bit of a misnomer because these were not simply, like log sheets where we documented the works that we had read or how much time we had spent reading. Rather, something like reading journals would be more accurate, since the task was to write journal-type entries discussing our reflections upon the items that we had been assigned to read. And there were page expectations, too, over the course of a set period, and I don't remember if it was, a week or a month, a quarter, or whatever. We were supposed to turn in a minimum number of pages worth of these reading logs. Now, I hated these reading logs with a passion. Inevitably, I would put them off until like a day or two max before they were due to be turned in, and then I would fill up a significant portion of my requisite 10 pages with my reflections on how reading logs were stupid and how much I loathed doing them, which of course I'm sure was tremendously enjoyable to read for my teachers. I suppose, though, that this did demonstrate my mastery of one of the oldest, most classical forms of human communication, the complaint. Indeed, I can sympathize with the Israelites as we meet up with them again in the midst of their long journey to freedom that we've been following over these past few weeks. Many of you will remember that when we first dropped in on them, that when they were struggling under the mighty weight of oppression and slavery at the hands of the Egyptians and Pharaoh, their king, we stood beside Moses in front of a bush that burned but was not consumed, and we heard the call of God to tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. We huddled with them in fear and anticipation as they prepared for their great escape in the wake of the greatest plague, the plague of death itself. We marched among them, our feet on dry ground as they crossed through the Red Sea, and we celebrated with them on the other side. Victory is achieved, freedom is found. But now what? As so often happens in life, the moment of triumph comes, the long yearned for outcome is achieved, and it turns out that not everything is puppy dogs and butterflies on the other side. In the Israelites' case, they made their way out of the slavery and they broke the chains of oppression, but landing safe on Canaan's side, as the great hymn puts it, that is, arriving in the promised land, is still a long, long way off for them. In the meantime, all they can see is that they have traded in a bondage that they knew for a barren wilderness that they did not. And so, almost predictably, if you've spent any time at all in a church or a workplace or a community organization or even in a family, the complaining begins. This is stupid. At least we could have died with food in our stomachs and something to do, but no, starvation and boredom it is for us now. Thanks, Moses. Some scholars have suggested that the word we read here as complained might actually be something closer to murmured. They murmured, like those infamous parking lot conversations that church people sometimes fall into. Pastor Matt, some people are saying that it would have been better if we would have never left Egypt. Really? Some people? Oh, well, I don't want to tell tales out of school, but I've heard that some people are saying that. The Israelites, they murmured. In any event, murmuring or complaining, standing in the camel parking spots, having their after-meeting conversation, or outright complaining to their Hebrew language arts teachers in their weekly reading journals, the word got back to Moses. And it got back to God, too. The passage we have heard today reminds us multiple times that the Lord has heard the complaining. Just like way back near the beginning of the epic saga when the voice spoke from the burning bush, quote, "I have observed the misery of my people. I have heard their cry." We can joke about the complaining of the people, and indeed, as the story goes on, the complaining does get a bit more petty and absurd and annoying, but hunger is no laughing matter. Neither God nor Moses nor the text itself seem to place judgment on the people for their complaining, at least at this point. In fact, it is their complaining that seems to prompt God's life-sustaining response. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it is at least mildly ironic, given my distaste for language arts classes back in middle school and high school, that I find myself doing so much writing these days. Alas, people do change and grow, and there's quite a bit about the world of literature and writing that I appreciate a whole lot more now than I did back in the day. I've never still really gotten into journaling, though. And so back when I was in seminary in my early 20s, there was at least one instance where I made something like a repeat performance of my earlier complaint-filled compositional techniques to my English teachers. Some of you will perhaps remember that during my second year in seminary, alongside classes, I worked a part-time internship, theological field education, as they call it, with a Puerto Rican UCC congregation on the west side of Chicago. And this particular internship took place through an experimental program that the seminary was running to explore the ways that these field education things are done. Without going into a lot of details, the reality was that by the midpoint of that first semester, I had become quite discouraged and disappointed. Namely, I felt like I wasn't getting very much experience doing ministerial things, and wasn't that what I was in seminary and doing field education for? So at some point in that semester, a bit on, halfway or two-thirds or whatever, we were tasked with submitting reflection journals. The vast majority of what I wrote sounded like those earlier tones of complaint. Not so much about the task of writing journals. I mean, although I had, after all, just like when I was in high school, put it off until the last minute, and so I was scrambling to fill up my page count. But rather, I largely wrote about how I didn't feel like this program was giving me what I was supposed to be getting out of field education, and how I was wrestling with whether I should simply exit the program and try to arrange a different, more traditional internship for the spring. A few weeks later, when I met with the professor to go over these journal reflections, the professor who would eventually become my advisor and be a good mentor, I was still wrestling with whether or not I should stay in this internship program, to the point that I felt caught in this very anxious, almost sort of panicky spiral. Panicky is probably a good way to describe the way that the Israelites felt as they made their way through, the 4th week and the 5th week and the 6th week and beyond of their time in the wilderness. After all, as I said, hunger is no laughing matter. But here's the thing about this story, and I have to give credit to the Reverend Dr. Nancy Taylor, senior minister just up the road in Boston at our historic landmark, Old South Church there on Copley Square, for lifting up this insight recently. But here's the thing about this story, as she says. The story of the manna in the wilderness and quails appearing out of nowhere, it's not a miracle story. There are miracle stories in the Bible, but this is not one of them. It is not a story of God pointing a wand, intoning abracadabra, and making something out of nothing. In this story, God's generosity is already there before the people panic. It's built into creation. It's baked into creation, there from its foundation. The Israelites, in their panic, just don't know how to look or what to look for. New to the desert, they don't recognize its offerings. You see, the manna, which seemed a miracle to the hungry Israelites, was and is an ordinary occurrence, a natural phenomenon in the Sinai Peninsula. Manna is the product of a type of plant lice, puncturing the fruit of the tamarisk tree and excreting a substance from its juice. When the temperature cools, the substance congeals. It is sweet in taste and rich in carbohydrates and sugar. As to the quail, they migrate in large flocks from Africa or the Mediterranean, and by the time they arrive in the Sinai Peninsula, they are often exhausted enough to be caught by hand. For the Israelites, a crisis of food begets a crisis of faith. And why wouldn't it? They didn't see the manna for what it was, and they didn't know that the quail were about to appear. They needed to adjust to their new normal, to trust God's benevolent providence that it was there, but perhaps in an unrecognizable form. In his always calm and deeply thoughtful manner, having read my journals, my mentor, advisor, professor said to me, "I can't tell you whether or not you should stay in the program or leave it, but I can tell you what I think you should do." And then he began to lay out the idea of adding an extra year to go off on a full-time, full-year pastoral internship in a local church, just as he had done when he was back in seminary in the 70s or 80s, I can't remember. That's how I could get what it was that I was seeking, and do so in a much deeper, more impactful way than any of the usual concurrent field placements could provide. This is, in the end, what I chose to do, as some of you know, leading me to that full-time, full year I spent on the staff of a UCC church in the Washington, D.C. area. But here's the thing. Here's why I'm telling you this. Making the decision to follow my advisor's advice and seek out this other experience, it also transformed the experience that I was having there in the internship that I was presently engaged in. I stayed in that program. And I learned at least one, if not many, of some of the most profound and important things I've ever learned in my ministerial formation by being with that Puerto Rican church on the west side of Chicago. But you see, at the end of the day, I had become so focused on demanding of that situation things that it couldn't ultimately provide, that I had blinded myself to the gifts and graces and experiences that I could receive there, that God had already laid out for me there. There is so much about our lives right now that make it feel like we are way out in the wilderness. It is a strange world we find ourselves in, and we are unaccustomed to its ways, and we are uncertain. Uncertain of ourselves, uncertain of others, uncertain about what has gone, uncertain about what's around the next bend. We have been thrown for a loop so many times this year, from the pandemic to natural disasters to politics to what many of us fear could happen, especially in light of the major headline dominating our news since Friday evening. And yet, as Nancy Taylor said to her congregation, when the pandemic struck and we found ourselves in strange wilderness places, it seemed to us a God-forsaken place. Empty shelves, store closures, social distancing, panic, and rumors. Yet with a little chance to adjust our vision, to acquaint ourselves with the contours of this new terrain, it turns out that this wilderness is not so much God-forsaken as it is God-filled. God doth provide, and yet not always as we had expected. She goes on to list all of the hidden glimpses of God's blessing and God's provision that have happened in her own life and in the life of Old South Church just in these 6 months since March. We could name them here too. Of the folks who have reached out to one another with connections of care, of the relationships that people have gotten to know one another because, we randomly sort ourselves in Zoom rooms rather than simply going to talk to the people we already know at coffee hour. Of the ministries that we have carried on in this community and amongst our congregation. And what about you? Torah, this section of the Old Testament from which this Exodus story comes, Torah, after all, means teaching. What is the teaching in this moment, in this story, in this moment in our world? For you. Are you learning to look for God's blessings with new eyes and in new places? Perhaps because you've suddenly realized you can't use the old ones. Have you adapted your diet to a new circumstance? Are you learning to live in the moment, to forsake hoarding, to trust God? Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto God now and forever. Amen.